Hello and welcome. This is India Tonight. I'm Shabani Gharat. Now, the big story that we are tracking, of course, is USTR Jamieson Anderson is in India. Now, for what seems to be the final leg of the negotiations between India and US for the trade deal. If successful, we could have a trade deal by as early as July 24th. India is pushing for preferential market access and comparative advantage over the peers as India and US stand at the cusp of making history with a breakthrough in negotiations. We discuss the trade deal with our guest tonight. We are now joined in by Dr. Nilanjan Ghosh, who is the Vice President Development Studies and Observer at Observer Research Foundation, which is ORF. Thank you so much, Mr. Ghosh, for joining us today on ET Now. The timing of this visit by, Jamieson Greer is critical because just last week at the G7, President Trump met Prime Minister Narendra Modi. So having said that, do you think we'll be able to meet the July 24th timeline?
First of all, thank you for inviting me to this discussion. This is, of course, a very significant development, and especially Greer's visit comes days after the Modi-Trump meeting at the G7 and exactly 1 month before the July 24 deadline. Now, of course, the timing is highly significant because trade negotiations, as we know, often move fastest when political leadership provides the strategic direction. And of course, the Modi-Trump interaction at the G7 appears to have done precisely that. Now, Greer's visit should therefore not be seen merely as a routine trade consultation, but rather it should be part of the, I would say, the broader political effort to convert high-level strategic convergence into a concrete economic agreement. So at July 24th deadline, as you rightly mentioned, Shivani, in fact, creates the urgency. Though neither side really wants a prolonged uncertainty. Of course, there is a bit of uncertainty given the uncertainty prevailing in global geopolitics, and particularly when global trade is already facing disruptions because of the geopolitical tensions, the supply chain uncertainties, the supply chain realignments that are happening, and the energy market volatility. Therefore, the next few weeks, this is what I perceive, will likely determine whether the two countries can bridge the remaining differences and move towards at least an interim framework agreement. So this is what I really feel.
Right. Some of the stickling points, of course, Dr. Ghosh, is, the Section 301, of course, protection of dairy, of agriculture, manufacturing, and the conversation around digital and tech as a whole. Tell us what else will be discussed during this two-day visit by Greer.
Of course, Section 301, that is something very critical because this is a provision of US trade law that really authorizes the US to investigate and respond to trade practices which, according to its own perception, is unfair, which it deems as unfair or discriminatory. Now, this has been its principal instrument which the US has used during the US-China trade war, and in the context of India, it serves primarily as the source of what you call a negotiating leverage on issues such as market access, digital trade, intellectual property, and tariffs. So the larger question is whether both countries can move beyond these disputes and conclude a broader strategic economic partnership. Now, the Section 301 issue is it's not merely, I would say, it's political, but it's both economic and symbolic. For Washington, it's about addressing whether it views what it views as market access barriers and the digital trade restrictions and tariff asymmetries. In India, the concern is a bit different. The concern is that the unilateral tariff measures are creating uncertainty and they undermine the very spirit of partnership. So both sides should recognize, rather they are recognizing, that the broader strategic relationship is too important to be held hostage by individual disputes. The real challenge is finding a compromise that addresses the American concerns, whereas in fact it also preserves, upholds the very spirit of partnership. And of course it has to uphold India's policy space for development and industrialization. In that sense, I reckon that Section 301 is not the negotiation itself. It is one of the hurdles within a much larger strategic, I would say, economic conversation.
Right, right.
So,
Also, Dr. Ghosh, let's quickly discuss the tariffs over here. Now, Trump administration is known to be going back and forth on tariffs. We know for a fact that India is seeking the preferential tariff advantage over the other ASEAN countries or, countries such as Vietnam or Bangladesh in terms of, advantage when it comes to tariff benefits. And then, of course, there is a fear that there is a reciprocal tariff or, like a punitive tariff that the administration can again go on and impose. So what is your stand on that? Like, how can we play around the tariff game?
India, of course, is pushing strongly for the preferential market access, and India recognizes that global supply chains are undergoing their biggest restructuring since China's accession to the WTO. And in any case, we find that companies are diversifying their production locations, countries are competing aggressively to attract investment and export opportunities. And in such an environment, even a small tariff advantage can significantly influence investment decisions. So if Indian exporters receive more favorable access to the American market than competitors in certain sectors, of course, Vietnam or South Korea or Indonesia and others, it could boost exports. It can attract manufacturing investment and it can create employment. So India's objective should therefore be not merely to sell more products to the United States, but to strengthen its position with the global value chains at a time when production networks are getting reconfigured. Now, this is, of course, important in the broader context of what we call the supply chain diversification. And that is arguably the most important geopolitical driver behind the deal. So US, of course, wants resilient and trusted supply chains that are less reliant and less dependent on China. And one of the reasons why, in fact, it was also promoting the IMEC. India wants to become a major manufacturing hub and attract investment from firms seeking alternative production bases. So both these objectives are mutually reinforcing. That is what we have to acknowledge. So this is why sectors such as electronics, then semiconductors, say pharmaceuticals, critical minerals, renewable energy equipment, and advanced manufacturing have adequate strategic advantage. So the negotiations are therefore not only about the trade flows today, it's also about where the future production and investment are going to get located.
Absolutely. When the fine print of the deal came through in February, before that, it was the India-EU trade deal, which was supposedly called the mother of all deals. Then, the India-US trade deal was called the father of all deals. And, the fine print came around February. Now we are sitting towards the end of the June. A lot of things have transpired in the last 4 months, including the West Asia crisis, including the LPG shortage, the energy crisis that the world has been through. Help us understand, if this deal indeed goes through on July 24th, will it be able to counter China's trade dominance and put India in a better spot in Asia?
See, as I see it, that the most important economic impact would likely come through investments and supply chain integration than through the tariff reductions alone.
Right.
And of course, electronics, pharmaceuticals, engineering goods, textiles, defense manufacturing, semiconductors, digital services, these are going to emerge as major beneficiaries in this entire game. Now, increased investment from multinational firms can, of course, generate employment, boost exports, and in the process, there will be accelerated technology transfer as well. So the agreement could strengthen India's energy security by encouraging greater imports of American crude oil and LNG at a time when you are having tensions around the Strait of Hormuz, which are reminding us of the vulnerabilities associated with concentrated energy supply routes. So more broadly, a successful agreement would signal that India is becoming a central node in the evolving global economic architecture. But if the question is whether India is going to replace China, that's of course a bit more loaded. Frankly speaking, it's going to be an alternative given the fact that the globe is looking at China plus one. So one very critical element that over the last few years, we have not been able to take advantage of China plus one substantially, as well as many others, is also because of the fact that the business enabling environment or the very cost of doing business at times have been found to be a shade higher in India as compared to, say, destinations like Vietnam and Indonesia. So to a certain extent, that is something that's related to the internal business environment, though we have been improving over time, no doubt about that. So that is going to be one critical element. So in my view, the US-India trade deal should not be viewed simply as a negotiation over tariffs. Rather, it sits at rather it should be located, in fact, at the very intersection of trade, technology, energy security, supply chain resilience, and of course the Indo-Pacific geopolitics. So the real question is not whether tariffs are going to decline by a few percentage points. The real question is whether India can leverage this moment to become a preferred destination for the next wave of global investment, global manufacturing, and innovation.
Absolutely. Help us understand what happens if, the Section 301 talks fail in the coming days.
Well, as I see it, first of all, if it is not concluded, say by deadline, the most likely outcome is that the reciprocal tariffs imposed or threatened by the US on Indian goods would either if it gets concluded, we feel that the reciprocal tariffs are going to be withdrawn, suspended, or reduced substantially. So now see, the precise outcome depends on how the agreement is structured. So let's take, say, the best case scenario. Of course, you have a comprehensive trade agreement in place. India agrees to reduce tariffs in selected sectors. The US provides preferential treatments, preferential access for Indian exports. Reciprocal tariffs are rolled back or waived for India. And this is what India would ideally seek, because it would provide certainty to our exporters and the investors. So the whole purpose of the negotiation is to replace tariff confrontation with a rules-based framework. And if a deal is reached, then the very logic of reciprocal tariffs largely disappears. Scenario two, let's take that. What can happen? Maybe an interim limited agreement, which is most likely, maybe. And maybe, in fact, this might seem to be a bit more realistic, that in that case, some sectors receive tariff relief, some sectors remain under negotiation. Reciprocal tariffs may be suspended rather than permanently removed. The US retains the ability to reimpose them if negotiations fail. Now, this would allow both governments to claim success while continuing discussions on difficult issues such as agriculture and digital trade.
Right.
And the worst case scenario said no agreement, something that you are asking. If negotiations fail, well, reciprocal tariffs could be imposed or expanded. Indian exports to the US could become less competitive. Export-oriented sectors such as engineering, textiles, chemicals, gems, and jewelry are going to come under severe pressure. So the impact would depend on the tariff rate and the product coverage.
Right. Mr. Ghosh, finally, before we go, we have seen how rupee has been impacted over the past couple of months and how it has weakened. So if this deal indeed goes through, do you see an impact on the Indian rupee at all?
Well, to a certain extent, it depends on the kind of demand for the rupee. And in any case, the decline actually happens or the devaluation, the depreciation keeps on happening precisely because of the selling pressure, and that is what actually prevailed, in fact, in the market. But as far as this trade deal is concerned, to a certain extent, if it continues as far as US dollar is concerned, then naturally, to a certain extent, the very depreciation of the weakening of the rupee, as you know, is going to boost the exports to a certain extent, but it's going to have definitely a deterring impact on the macroeconomy as a whole, especially the macroeconomic variables. So I presume that definitely, there are other countervailing, intervening factors, and at some point in time, the RBI is going to intervene.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Ghosh, for joining us today on ET Now and for your inputs and insights as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much.